He had imagined buying a solution so many times that the rehearsals felt like truth. The check, the whispered nod behind a mahogany desk, the quiet reassigning of a waiting list. Marcus Ellison had built his life on solving problems other people said were permanent. Money was the lever he pulled when systems jammed. He was used to doors opening. The principal's voice, when it came, closed one he'd assumed was automatic. "We don't sell seats," she said, without heat. "We keep spaces for children, not for checks." The words landed like a verdict. Marcus stood in the glass-walled corner of Drayton Academy's head's office, a rain-slick courtyard visible below, and realized that none of his rehearsed lines had prepared him to hear refusal. He had expected curtsies of gratitude, a discreet arrangement. He had not expected to be spoken to like a man who had just asked a school to barter a child's place for money. He watched her face, calm, tired, honest. Dr. Evelyn Harper did not look defensive. She looked steady, as if she had rehearsed this refusal 1,000 times for herself. There was no cheap theatricality in her words, no sanctimony, just an old, firm principle that did not bend when confronted by a ledger. For a heartbeat, Marcus felt the raw animal churning that every leader learns to hide, the urge to assert control, to remind the world of what he could do with money. Then another feeling stepped into view, shorter, sharper, and stranger, embarrassment. Not for himself, alone, but for the habit of believing wealth equates to entitlement. If you had asked him a month before, he might have laughed at the idea of testing a school he'd been considering for his son. Marcus Ellison had a public life that impressed strangers, a tech company that had transformed payments, a foundation that put his name on community centers, a glossy philanthropy profile in magazines. He also had a private life that worried him awake at night. His son, Sam, had lately withdrawn in ways Marcus didn't understand. New classmates used words Marcus recognized: privilege, pedigree, legacy. But Sam's counselor had used others: belonging, safety, the quiet ritual of being known by teachers. Marcus had begun to wonder whether the type of school that filled the brochures and promised rigor and character meant what they said when no one was watching. Rumors swirl around elite admissions the way they do around closed boardrooms. Pay to play, donor influence, reserved seats for the right names. Marcus had heard the stories. He dismissed most, aware that rumor corrodes truth. But one small interaction with a parent at a fundraiser, an offhand comment, making room for certain families, took on the weight of evidence in his mind. Maybe, he thought, the school was as principled as it advertised. Or maybe, he thought, it was not. He could pay to secure his son's future, but what would that teach Sam? What would it teach other parents?
Wealth, Marcus had learned, can shield the children of the wealthy while leaving everyone else to the storm. So he decided to test Drayton Academy. Not for spectacle, not to humiliate. He wanted a clear answer. Would the school bend for power when asked, or would it hold to standards, even when standards made for awkward conversations? He did not walk into the admissions office waving his name. He planned the experiment with the kind of care he used to ship a product. Small pilots first, then scaled tests, documented metrics. He recruited 3 allies who understood how to gather facts without crossing ethical lines. Jamal Reed, his longtime advisor, mapped scenarios and cautioned against doing anything that would break the law or public trust. Nina Alvarez, an education reporter he'd worked with on a scholarship story, agreed to listen in if needed and to explain what journalistic pressure could and could not achieve. And Leah Monroe, counsel to his foundation, insisted on legal guardrails: what could be asked for, how records should be requested, and the limits of private schools' obligations. The plan was twofold and deliberate. Present Drayton with 2 faces of the same question. First, deploy an anonymous application, clean, strong on merit, thin on legacy, to see how the admissions process treated an ordinary, qualified child. Second, through a trusted intermediary, float an unsolicited large gift in exchange for consideration for a preferred candidate. Both approaches were entirely legal. Schools take gifts, applicants apply. The variable was motive and action. Would the school's response be consistent? Marcus watched the campus on the day the test started. It was early spring. The elm trees lining the entrance had matched the pale blue of Sam's backpack. Drayton's brick buildings smelled faintly of coffee and books. Parents hovered under umbrellas, renters of prestige and peace. Marcus took it all in as an outsider would. Precise hedges, teachers greeting children with small nicknames, a parent in a navy blazer who carried a resume as if it were a talisman. He could have sent his application anonymously from a corporate address. Instead, he chose to be more surgical. He asked Tasha Imani,
a former college counselor who ran a modest nonprofit, to submit as an independent party, an application that highlighted a child of real merit and need. Tasha's candidate was a good student, not wealthy, not connected. She would not speak a single word about Marcus Ellison's name. At the same time, Marcus engaged an intermediary, a respected philanthropist friend who would approach Drayton's development office with a hypothetical offer. The donor would not be explicit about wishes for admitting a specific child, but would suggest a large, unrestricted gift that had the practical effect of opening doors. This is the dance donors sometimes did. Marcus wanted to see whether the school would link access to dollars. He did not want it to be a sting.
He wanted a pattern, to see how the institution behaved when presented with a test it was not expecting. The first signs were small and subtle. Tasha reported that the anonymous application encountered delays. Requests for supplementary materials were more numerous and more inquisitive than for some other candidates. Admissions asked for teacher recommendations twice, stricter than sheer policy suggested. Nothing was proof, only texture, slower replies, the odd bureaucratic clog. The donor approach produced a different texture. The development office returned a call within the hour. The tone was warm. An invitation to lunch came fast. "We'd love to show you our new wing," the director said. The language was different, hospitality instead of interrogation. That contrast tightened Marcus's chest in a way he could not ignore. There are things money fixes immediately. There are things it cannot touch, not with partnership. Marcus was used to the first. He knew how to write checks that would breed swift infrastructural change. He had learned, through harsher curricula than boardrooms, that putting money into a system without understanding its rules can reinforce the things that made it unfair in the first place. That was why this wasn't a child's fight for a seat. It was a test of what the school would let itself become when tempted. He could have taken the donor meeting himself. Instead, he asked Jamal to go in as a private citizen with no hint of the Ellison name, to measure overtures and phrases. Jamal had a dry, courteous manner that invited candor. He left the lunch with notes, an unguarded remark from a senior fundraiser about reserved spots for significant benefactors, a tentative sentence about bookending our capital campaign with legacy families, a tone that suggested that money could, in practice, be linked to access. That line, an airy phrase, was not a smoking gun. It was enough to make Marcus uneasy. The truth, he understood, rarely announced itself like a confession. It arrived as small tensions. The anonymous applicant faced hurdles. The donor found smoothness. That difference created an ethical problem, not just for a single family, but for any parent who believed the school belonged to the community it served. So Marcus asked to speak with Dr. Evelyn Harper. He chose the moment carefully, a late afternoon when the corridors hummed with the sort of quiet only schools know when the day has thinned and only small clusters of people remain. He wanted a private conversation. He wanted to hear in person how Drayton's leadership framed the tension between philanthropy and fairness. He expected a negotiation. He did not expect the refusal. "Mr. Ellison," Dr. Harper said when he took the offered seat. She did not expect surprise. She did not ask, "Are you here to use influence?" She had seen various kinds of visitors. She had also spent 20 years in education, including stints in tight-budgeted public schools, and what she carried in her posture by now was a fatigue that public responsibility breeds. "You're considering Drayton for your son," she said, and it was not a question. It was the axiom of the meeting. He had arrived for something ordinary. Marcus told her the two sides of the experiment without flourish. He told her about the anonymous application and the donor overture. He told her, quietly, why he'd done it. He did not accuse. He asked. "I wanted to know if Drayton keeps its promises," he said. She looked at him a long time before she answered. The seasons of headship had taught her a certain wariness about grand gestures. "You're testing us," she said eventually. It was not a complaint. It was an observation. "And you want to know whether I'll trade access for a gift." Marcus held his breath. "I want to know whether equity is just language here," he said, "or practice." Dr. Harper folded her hands. Outside, a delivery truck put down a stack of new library books. The inflection of that mundane event grounded the room. "We do not sell seats," she said, "and we do not barter for influence. If you came here thinking a check could solve the problem for your child, you came to the wrong place. If you came here because you want to open doors, then talk to me about how your resources can be used to make those doors wider for everyone." Marcus felt the world narrow to the space between the two of them. She had given him a refusal that was not rhetorical, an ethical boundary drawn with a clear marker. But it was not a simple rebuke. Hidden beneath refusal was an invitation. Change the system rather than buy out of it. He had imagined being greeted by pliant fingers on a ledger, not this blunt, unsettling ethics. He could have laughed it off. Instead, something like respect pushed up alongside his shock. The old habit of power,
spend until the problem yields, fought with a newer one, listen, learn, invest in the structures that actually move outcomes. It is one thing to be denied. It is another to be shown why the denial matters. Dr. Harper explained the practicalities of that why. She spoke of the offers schools accept and the ones they decline. She talked about donor expectations that attach to gifts, sometimes invisible strings woven into naming opportunities or programming choices. She was precise about the danger. When a school begins to equate financial largesse with moral standing, it shifts from educating children to managing reputations. You do not want your philanthropy to change who we are, she said, and we do not want to change the communities we serve because someone's check is louder than their commitment. There was a second, more painful truth in her voice. She admitted that Drayton, like every institution, was imperfect. There had been years when the school had taken gifts that created opportunities, but also obligations.
There had been board members who worshipped at the altar of prestige and sometimes nudged admissions conversations in subtle ways. She did not absolve those years. She named them. She did not excuse them. That was the other shock. Not a single sentence of moral superiority, but confession. Marcus had thought the school would be a monolith of compromise or a fortress of virtue. Instead, he found a human place, messy and trying, with leaders who wrestled with the same tensions any institution does when money and mission intersect. He left the meeting unsettled. He did not leave angry. He left with a new question. What responsibility did he bear as someone with the means to influence change? Power is a tool. The shape of the hand that wields it mattered. Back at his car, the rain had slackened into a whisper. Marcus called Jamal and ran through the conversation. Jamal, practical as ever, wanted evidence beyond conversation. Words are important, Jamal said, but documents are how the world changes. You have to prove there's a pattern. Marcus understood the prudence. He had not come to Drayton to stage a spectacle. He had come to learn. If there was a systemic preference given to wealth, it would show in records. Timing of offers, donor acknowledgments on admissions lists, board minutes where donors and candidates smoothed each other's paths. He could pursue an adversarial path, drop the story to a reporter, force an audit, but he could also talk with Dr. Harper about structural solutions, an independent audit of admissions, binding agreements on donor influence, and the transparency that malpractice harder and accountability easier. He chose to pursue both, gather facts, prepare to demand change. Jamal would search the public-facing breadcrumbs, tax filings that might indicate donor patterns, board minutes were available, alumni notes praising those who helped. Mina agreed to keep an ear open. Leah insisted they proceed on a clear legal plane, formally request records from the school and any foundation affiliated with it, use discovery only where appropriate, and avoid any tactics that would cross into trespass or deceit. Marcus's team moved quietly. Tasha provided follow-ups on her anonymous applicant's experience. The anonymous application remained in limbo, requests multiplied, decisions delayed. Marcus suspected this was not random. When admissions sent a set of supplementary forms, a pattern emerged. The anonymous applicant's documents had been requested with unusual scrutiny. Earlier candidates, those linked to known families, received far quicker responses. This was not proof of malfeasance, but it was enough to demonstrate inconsistency. Then something unexpected happened. A junior faculty member, an English teacher named Daniel Ortiz, approached Marcus after a Saturday morning band recital and handed him a folded envelope. Marcus took it without reading, feeling the burn of risk. Whistleblowing has a price. He opened the envelope in the quiet of his car. Inside were photocopies of emails, anonymized but legible, between a former development officer and a consultant hired by the school. They were not explosive in the cinematic way tabloids imagine. They were mundane and damning in their own way. Subject lines discussing major gifts we can leverage, notes about reserved donor consideration, casual language suggesting that certain applicants came with a pipeline. There was also a redacted spreadsheet that tracked donor gifts against admission cycles. Names were blacked out, but the numbers were clear. Correlated spikes in donations and in acceptances, not a single smoking gun match, but a pattern suggestive of influence. Marcus felt his throat close. He thought of Sam, small hands at the back of a school assembly looking for a place to sit. He thought of the math of reputation and the stubbornness of institutions to protect themselves with euphemisms. He thought of the principal's voice again. We don't sell seats. These documents gave texture to suspicion. They were also dangerous. They required careful handling. Leah's voice in his ear was immediate. Verify, cross-check, protect sources. The next days were a choreography. Careful requests, discreet conversations, and the assembly of a dossier that could not easily be shrugged off as rumor. Leah wrote a formal letter requesting an internal review of admissions processes. Dr. Harper agreed to a meeting to discuss transparency measures. Jamal, always the strategist, suggested a conditional offer. Marcus would seed a fund for scholarships that would only be released in tranches after an independent review showed policy changes. That move would be strategic.
It offered resources but required reform. Not everyone supported restraint. In private, a friend from Marcus's old circles, someone who had seen favors granted for fewer reasons, urged a simpler path. Write the check and be done. You can buy time, the friend said. You can smooth the edges. No one will be hurt. The friend meant well. The friend saw the transactional world as efficient. Marcus felt in that moment the gravity of his choice. Money could indeed unjam administrative friction. It could buy a seat. It could buy comfort. But it could also cement a system that turned access into privilege and privilege into precedent. He had built companies that ate friction with cash. This, he realized, was not one of those moments. He wanted a legacy that did not merely buy peace for his own child, but increased the number of children who could sit where they belonged because of merit and opportunity, not because of a ledger entry. With Dr. Harper's cooperation, Marcus agreed to a quiet pilot, an independent review of admissions practices by a respected nonprofit auditor, selected by joint consent.
The auditor's brief would include a timeline of admissions decisions, donor records, and any communication between development staff and admissions committees. It would ask whether policies were being applied equally and whether any donor relationships created undue influence. That agreement felt, in its tentative way, like progress. It channeled Marcus's impulse to act money first into an accountability first approach. It preserved the possibility of partnership with a head who had, with her words and her candor, disarmed his anger and invited him into a different kind of philanthropy. Still, in the ledger of risk there was always another column, exposure. The documents Daniel had given Marcus could be devastating if published. They could force a reckoning. They could also harm teachers who had no hand in policy choices, or parents whose children had nothing to do with board-level decisions. Marcus thought of spectacle and its ruinous appetite. He thought of the teachers he had met who stayed late to help a struggling student. He thought of the principal who had refused to sell a seat even when offered a check. He was not interested in vengeance. He wanted justice. "Tell me what you want," Dr. Harper said at their next meeting when the auditor's terms were being drawn up. The admission of prior mistakes had loosened something between them, but the question now demanded specificity. Marcus found himself answering in ways he had not predicted. "I want policy that can't be sidestepped by charm or by a large gift," he said. "I want a process that is transparent enough that parents who don't have my resources can see it work. I want a scholarship program that reaches kids who would be overlooked otherwise, and I want the record to show how decisions are made." Dr. Harper listened. She adjusted the language in the Memorandum of Understanding with the auditor. She accepted the idea of anonymized reporting on admissions metrics for the school year. She agreed to a board workshop on conflict of interest. She pushed back on one point, public disclosure of donor names linked to individual admissions decisions, arguing that confidentiality in philanthropy sometimes protects donors who prefer privacy, and that the institution had to balance transparency with legal obligations and donor relationships. That pushback revealed the contours of the problem. Institutions do not live in moral abstractions. They live in legal contracts, in alumni relations, and philanthropic ecosystems. Some donors expect privacy. Some board members believe that large gifts underpin the school's ability to offer resources to all students. The friction Marcus had seen in earlier documents was not a plot. It was a knot of practical choices and mistaken incentives. The pilot review began quietly. Marcus fundraised through his foundation for the auditor's costs. He did not name the amount publicly. He did not seek headlines. The team gathered records, admissions timetables, donor acknowledgments, minutes of development meetings. They looked for patterns rather than individual sins. The goal was structural: create a set of recommendations, enforceable and sensible, that wouldn't make reform optional. But documents have teeth. Once Daniel's envelope had been opened, a new variable entered the experiment: the possibility that other staff or even parents had information. Rumors have a way of finding air if given a slit. At the school, conversations took on a different timbre. A teacher who once joked about the school's traditions now spoke in lower tones about pressure from board members. A parent who had lobbied for a club now questioned how decisions around who taught which program were made. Marcus felt the hum of tension grow. Change, he had learned, creates friction. Power resists because it is comfortable. People who have navigated the currents of fundraising for decades do not always recognize how their practices can entrench inequality. But Marcus also saw seeds. Dr. Harper convened a listening session for faculty. Parents were invited to a transparent town hall about philanthropy and policy. The school's communications director prepared a statement about the independent audit. Not everyone was satisfied. A small but vocal group of alumni wrote privately to the board, anxious that the school's reputation might be bruised by airing grievances. They wanted discretion, not disclosure.
They worried about the name of Drayton and the implications for alumni giving. In their letters lurked the familiar argument, reputation is fragile, better to keep things quiet. On a Tuesday morning, an unsigned op-ed appeared in the local online paper, a piece that wrestled with the reality of private schools and donor influence without naming Drayton. Philanthropy can help repair injustice, it read. It can also fossilize privilege. The line between charity and control is thin. Nina Alvarez, the reporter Marcus had trusted, called him to say she'd seen it, and that it might be a harbinger. Others were thinking out loud. She asked if the source material she had been offered months ago still mattered. These issues resonate, she said. They get attention when people feel the fairness of systems is at stake. Marcus was ready to pivot to public pressure if the board resisted reform. He had the means to support a campaign that would force transparency. But he also knew how quickly a public spectacle could ruin people who had no sin greater than poor judgment. He continued to prefer slow structural repair to pyrotechnic exposure. Yet the anonymous application languished. The donor overture had not translated into a named seat, but the pattern, faster processing for connected applicants, was clear enough. It was the kind of inertia that reforms encounter, not theft, but bias encoded into habits. Then, in a meeting with Dr. Harper and Leah, a new document surfaced.
It was a set of board minutes from a few years prior, noting in thin prose an agreement to prioritize certain families during admission cycles, tied to contributions for the new science wing. The language had been couched in the euphemistic tones of fundraising, strategic stewardship, legacy engagement. But the minutes were specific enough to show that the board had, at times, accepted that donor relationships would be considered in admission strategy. It was not as crude as selling a seat for a sum of money, but it was a procedural backdoor that placed influence where it should not have been. Dr. Harper's face went pale when she read them. "I didn't draft these minutes," she said, "but I've seen the culture that produced them." Marcus's hand tightened on the paper. He had not wanted to find this. He had wanted to teach his son about belonging, not battle over a ledger. Yet there it was, a thread he could pull. "All we can ask for now," Leah said quietly, "is that the board act, make a clear policy that severs any link between donor stewardship and admissions decisions, implement the auditor's recommendations, and tie any future gifts to specific programmatic outcomes rather than to admissions discretion." Dr. Harper agreed to bring the minutes to the board with a recommendation, explicit, binding prohibitions on considering donations in admissions. She warned that not all board members might agree. Some would argue that long-term institutional survival required the goodwill of benefactors. Marcus understood the survival argument. He also felt the moral one. They planned the motion, they planned the meeting. They agreed that transparency, once initiated, could not be half-hearted. If the board refused reforms, Marcus would face a choice: fund quietly and risk ensuring the old bias, or escalate, publicize evidence, involve Nina, and let public pressure reshape institutional choices. Jamal urged prudence. Leah urged firmness. Marcus told himself he was prepared for either outcome. In truth, he was not. The choice between protecting a child's immediate comfort and protecting the integrity of the system that would shape many futures weighed at him like a gentle, persistent current. 2 nights before the board meeting, Marcus sat alone in his study with the photocopies from Daniel spread across his desk. He thought of the principal's words, the refusal that had both stung and steadied him. He thought of Sam, who had been practicing piano in the next room, who came to him with small questions about schoolyard culture and friendship. He thought of the teacher who had handed him the envelope, risking livelihood to speak. He thought of the families who would be affected by whatever came next. He arranged the documents into a chronology: anonymous applicants' treatment, donor overture, minutes, emails, communications patterns. Each piece was a small thing. Together they formed a seam that would not hold if pushed. A part of him wanted the immediate catharsis of public exposure, the quick collapse of duplicity, the headlines that would make sinners confess and boards reform overnight. He imagined a different self, one who could exact retribution and close his son's case with a flourish. But another part, the part that had learned how institutions change slowly under pressure, and how spectacle can tear as easily as mend, prevailed. He resolved to give Drayton one chance to fix what the documents implied. He would present the evidence to the board as a citizen with resources and a demand for reform. He would release funds conditionally to the auditing nonprofit if Drayton accepted binding governance changes. Only if the school resisted would he consider leveraging the press. That was the moment when strategy, not spectacle, would have to do the work. When he arrived at the board meeting the following week, the room thrummed with the kind of polite gravity that boards cultivate: patterned carpet, a long table scarred by the minutes of past debates, portraits that watched with the mild indifference of tradition.
Some board members were new to him. Others wore the institutional memory in their shoulders. The alumni cohort sat off to the side, anxious. Dr. Harper sat across the table with the same steadiness that had refused his money and then invited him in. Marcus took out the photocopies and laid them on the table. He did not theatrically accuse. He read the minutes aloud, letting the language's euphemisms do their own revealing. He presented the auditor's preliminary timeline. He explained the conditional funding proposal, money for scholarships, dispersed only as binding reforms were implemented. He asked for a vote to adopt clear policy that severed donor influence from admissions. The room responded with the slow machinery of governance. Some board members listened, fingers steepled. A veteran trustee stroked his chin and argued that fundraising practices had saved programs and that reform could be blunt and dangerous. "We cannot alienate the people who keep our lights on," he said. A younger trustee said the minutes were unacceptable. "If we do not act," she said, "we will be an institution that prizes reputation over justice." The vote would not be immediate. Procedure required committees, charter amendments, and the slow turning of institutional levers. But one thing shifted. The matter could no longer be dismissed as rumor. It had been put into the meeting minutes, into the record, and that mattered. Marcus left the meeting with no guarantees, but with a new reality. A process had begun. Outside the building, as the late afternoon light softened, a parent approached Marcus with a blunt question. "Are you going to make this public?" she asked. "My child is here. I want reform, but I don't want chaos." Marcus met her gaze. He understood both the hunger for change and the fear of collateral damage. "I want reform," he said.
"I want it to be real and durable. I'll try the channels we agreed to. If those channels are blocked, I'll use my voice. That isn't a threat, it's a responsibility." When he walked to his car, the first rain of the season began again, tapping the windshield like small, persistent questions. He thought of the principal's first line, "We don't sell seats." It had been a rebuke, yes, but also a moral compass. It made clear what Drayton aspired to be, and it exposed how far aspiration could stray if the wrong incentives find their way into practice. Marcus's phone buzzed with a message from Nina. She had been hearing murmurs and wondered whether she should run a piece on donor influence in private schools broadly. He asked her to wait. He wanted the audit to run its course, to give the institution a chance to do the hard work. He also knew the moment where restraint could be mistaken for weakness. The balance between patience and pressure had never felt so precarious. That night, Marcus went home and sat beside Sam while the boy practiced scales. The routine of the piano, the small repetition that teaches mastery, felt like a counterpoint to the boardroom's rhetoric. Marcus found in that room the reason for his restraint, a desire not to meet a problem with power, but to build a better system that made power less necessary. But the documents in Daniel's envelope would not be idle forever. Patterns, once observed, insist upon consequences. The anonymous applicant still waited. The donor overture still had made its way into a lunch chair at the development office. The minutes had been read aloud in a boardroom. The auditor had started its work. Momentum had been set. Before dawn, Marcus found himself awake, staring at the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his apartment. He imagined the headlines that might yet come. Board under fire, donors and influence, parents question equity. He imagined Sam reading such an article years from now and wondering how his father had behaved when faced with imperfect choices. He reached for the one page that had felt like both accusation and confession, the set of board minutes that revealed the compromise. He had no desire to weaponize it, but neither could he ignore the responsibility it presented. He had to ensure the changes he promised his son were more than words. By midweek, the board had scheduled a special committee to draft a conflict of interest policy explicitly forbidding consideration of donor relationships in admissions decisions. Dr. Harper had agreed to an independent admissions officer who reported to the committee rather than to development. Marcus drafted the terms of the Conditional Scholarship Fund, substantial, targeted, with clear criteria and an oversight board that included parents, alumni, and an independent auditor.
As the pieces slid into place, a new voice entered the scene, a former trustee, anonymous to the public but vocal in private, who warned that reforms could lead to a reduction in critical funding that underwrote financial aid and the arts. The argument had force. If donor dollars dwindled, the very programs that benefit less privileged students could suffer. It was the paradox of philanthropy. The same stream that can create inequity also pays for remedial tuition for students who need help. That reality complicated Marcus's calculus. He had promised himself a route that aligned values and resources, but institutional ecosystems are not binary. Cutting off donors without building replacement revenue risked harming the children Marcus wanted to help.
The next morning, Leah sent him a draft of an enforceable covenant that would allow donors to give while prohibiting any tie between a gift and admissions decisions. It had legal finesse, it had practical teeth. It offered a compromise. Keep life's necessary streams flowing, but erect a firewall between access and money. Marcus read the covenant 3 times. He thought of the principal's line again. We don't sell seats. The covenant would not erase the past. It could build a future where Drayton no longer had to make the painful choices its minutes once documented. He signed the memorandum proposing the conditional scholarship. He also asked Leah to send notice to the board that if they did not act on the covenant, he would consider making the evidence public. Not as a threat, she reminded him, only the truth. He wanted reform, not spectacle, but he also wanted sufficiency, policies that could not be rearranged by a clever euphemism. On the evening before the special committee met, the school was quieter than usual. Evening lights in classrooms hummed like distant sentinels. A janitor rolled a cart past the library windows. Marcus drove past the campus slowly, watching the building he had once viewed as a potential refuge for his son become instead the ground of scrutiny. He felt a fatigue that had nothing to do with late nights or spreadsheets. It was the tiredness of someone who had learned the cost of institutions' mistakes and was trying, clumsily and with conscience, to do something about them. He'd rehearsed what he would say to the board. He had prepared the photocopies, the auditor's preliminary notes, the covenant Leah had drafted. He had rehearsed calm. But rehearsals are only scaffolding. The real test was always how people behaved when their habits were in the light. The special committee convened in a glass conference room the next morning. Word had leaked enough that a smattering of parents trickled in early. A local reporter, someone from a community weekly, sat near the door with a notebook.
No cameras from major outlets yet. Nina was waiting, as they'd agreed, to see if the process produced meaningful change before she wrote anything that would make Drayton defensive rather than accountable. Dr. Harper opened the meeting with the clarity that had come to define her leadership. A short acknowledgement that the institution had work to do, a recognition of the community's anxiety, and a promise to let facts guide choices. Marcus watched her from the second row. It was one thing to speak at length in private. It was another to shepherd a room full of trustees, alumni, parents, and staff through the consequences of their past. The committee's chair, a retired judge whose gray hair suggested impartiality, called the meeting to order. Leah presented the covenant in legal terms, explaining how it would function. Donors could continue to give to named programs and capital projects, but there would be an explicit firewall in governance documents forbidding any donor or development officer from having influence over admissions. Breaches would be subject to sanctions and could trigger an independent review. The room absorbed the words. A few board members nodded. Others exchanged glances that suggested concern about future donations. A veteran trustee who had earlier cautioned against alienating benefactors raised his hand. His voice had the careful cadence of someone used to de-escalating controversy. "We can't simply cut off the streams that support our most vulnerable students," he said. "If we prohibit all relationships, we risk starving scholarships and arts programs that rely on philanthropy." Marcus met his gaze. He had anticipated this argument. "You do not have to cut off philanthropy," he said quietly when it was his turn to speak. "You have to create structures that prevent philanthropy from directing who walks through these doors. My proposal includes funds. In fact, it funds a scholarship program designed to increase access. It also insists that gifts be directed to programs, not to admissions. Donors can remain generous. They just can't be a deciding voice at the admissions table." The judge asked the auditor to summarize preliminary findings. The auditor spoke with the measured tone of someone trained to let the data do the talking. Timing inconsistencies in admission cycles, repeated references in emails to stewarding legacy families, and redacted minutes that suggested a view of donor stewardship as part of enrollment strategy. "We don't have evidence of an explicit contract exchanging money for a seat," the auditor said. "What we have is a collection of practices that, taken together, create conditions ripe for inequitable outcomes." That phrasing, not an explicit contract but practices, landed in the room like a weight. It explained how an institution could be neither corrupt nor innocent. It revealed the slow drift from mission to expedience that donors' expectations can encourage. The conversation widened.
Parents expressed their fears, some worried about reputation. Others, especially those whose children came from less privileged backgrounds, spoke with urgency about fairness. Teachers reported pressure, sometimes unspoken, to prioritize certain programs or donors. Alumni wrote in lamentation, some in defense, some in remorse.
The board's older guard defended their stewardship as pragmatic, the younger trustees demanded structural changes. At one point, a voice from the back, an alumnus who benefited from financial aid himself, rose to ask a pointed question. If we adopt the covenant, who will keep our community's priorities alive? How will we ensure that losing donor influence doesn't mean losing support for students like me? Marcus answered with the simple thought that had guided his action. We build mechanisms that align resources with mission. We diversify funding streams. We create transparency so that giving is celebrated for what it does, for the labs, for the arts, for the outreach programs, not for who it admits. After hours of deliberation, the committee voted to recommend the covenant to the full board, with amendments suggested by Leah to make enforcement more explicit. The vote passed by a hairline majority. It was a victory, but the kind that many institutional victories are, a step, not a finish line. Outside the meeting room, the school felt different. Conversations no longer skirted the issue. Teachers lingered in doorways and thanked Marcus privately for bringing the matter forward. Daniel, the English teacher who had given Marcus the envelope, hovered a little farther away. He was relieved, but also aware of the risk he had taken. Dr. Harper found Marcus and squeezed his shoulder, a small human gesture that conveyed both appreciation and the weight of what lay ahead. The board's full session in the following week was a slow do-or-die for the school's governance culture. Several trustees who had been skeptical asked for time to consult with family and donors. A faction suggested a compromise, adopt the covenant but create a development advisory liaison, whose role would be to explain donors' intentions without any authority in admissions, and attempt to make visibility without influence. Leah responded by tightening language to prevent advisory roles from evolving into de facto decision-making power. In the end, the full board voted to adopt the covenant and to commission a broader audit into the school's governance and fundraising practices. The vote was not unanimous. 2 trustees abstained. One resigned from the board shortly afterwards, citing concern that public scrutiny would harm the school's viability. The resigning trustee's statement expressed regret for any inequities and emphasized a belief in quiet reform, but it also underscored the real cost of institutional change. Some people, tied to history and reputation, prefer to leave rather than to bend. Once the covenant was passed, Dr.
Harper moved quickly to operationalize it. She proposed an oversight committee, a mix of parents, a faculty representative, alumni, and 2 independent members with expertise in nonprofit governance. She asked that admissions files be anonymized during review cycles wherever possible, and that any communication between development and admissions be logged and audited. She welcomed the idea of an independent admissions officer reporting to the oversight committee rather than to development. The oversight framework was imperfect, but it was real. Marcus made good on his pledge to fund the scholarship program. He formalized the terms with Leah. Sizable funds to be released in tranches tied to the auditor's milestones. First, the adoption of the covenant, then demonstrated implementation of anonymized admissions procedures, then an external review confirming compliance. The Oversight Committee had the ability to halt disbursements if the covenant was breached, ensuring a built-in accountability mechanism. With the policies in place, the auditor's final report was prepared. It was methodical, precise, and restrained in tone. The report highlighted the problematic practices, the language in minutes, emails with suggestive phrasing, preferential timelines and admissions, but it also named strengths: a head of school committed to transparency, a faculty that cared for students, and a community willing to engage in difficult conversation. The report's recommendations were practical: codify conflict of interest policies, anonymize applications where feasible, create enforceable donor covenants, and expand fundraising sources to reduce dependency on a small cohort of major benefactors. The board adopted the recommendations and issued a public statement acknowledging the findings, announcing the new covenant, the scholarship fund, and the formation of the Oversight Committee. They published an edited summary of the auditor's report, redacting personal identifiers but leaving enough detail for the public to see the issues and the remedies. The language of the statement reserved accountability without theatrical finger-pointing. It was a piece of responsible governance, transparent, corrective, and measured. Nina wrote her piece, but it was not an exposé that sought catharsis. She framed the story as a case study of how private, well-resourced institutions can acknowledge blind spots and pivot. Her article used Drayton as an example of potential reform, rather than as a cautionary tale of collapse. It reached a larger audience than anyone expected, and with that reach came a new set of stakeholders: donors who read the article and asked how they could give in ways that did not undercut admissions integrity, parents from neighboring schools who asked about the covenant as a template. There were consequences beyond policy. Some alumni withdrew planned gifts in protest, a painful but predictable response to change that threatened accustomed privilege.
A handful of donors approached Leah privately, wanting to understand how they could continue to support the school without the temptation or appearance of influence. 2 significant benefactors restructured their commitments, directing funds to named programs and scholarships with contractual stipulations that favored transparency. Their choices suggested that philanthropy could adapt when structures incentivized integrity. Not all reactions were positive. A small group of parents criticized Marcus publicly, accusing him of using his money to coerce governance changes. Online comment threads bristled with polarized takes. Marcus sat with Jamal and Leah more than once, parsing the difference between principled pressure and intimidation. He understood why some saw his actions as heavy-handed. He also knew that the quiet persistence of practices that favored the connected demanded pressure that felt, to some, uncomfortable. In the midst of governance shifts, the human parts of the story mattered most. At a fall parent-teacher gathering, Sam, who had been quiet and withdrawn months earlier, sat on a bench near a window, watching children gather. Marcus noticed the way Sam's shoulders had loosened in recent weeks. He had stopped moderating conversations about who belonged and instead asked small questions about projects and his classmates. He seemed in a modest way to be rediscovering the ordinary routines that anchor childhood. One afternoon, a young student from Marcus's scholarship program, a bright boy named Julian, whose application had been part of Tasha's initial submissions, gave a short presentation in an assembly about a science fair project on water filtration. Marcus sat in the back and watched Julian speak clearly and without self-consciousness. He thought of the times he had imagined buying his son's future, and of the principal's refusal, the line that had reframed his understanding of what influence ought to be. That refusal had been ultimately an invitation to use his resources differently. Not everything calmed. The oversight committee had to adjudicate a couple of small infractions, anonymous emails that sought to curry favor, a development officer who had to be retrained after a careless phrase in a donor meeting. The school's communications team rolled out clearer guidelines and training sessions. Change required maintenance, and the first months were full of small course corrections and a steady stream of questions. How do we anonymize when a child has a prominent alias? What about legacy policies tied to multi-generational families? Those gray areas demanded protocols rather than instant moralizing. Marcus's role evolved. He moved from the instinct to fix with a check to an inclination to fund systems that could sustain a fairer process.
He endorsed the training program for the development office, funded a modest boost to need-based financial aid, and contributed to a community fellowship program that allowed teachers and staff to design outreach efforts. He sat on the oversight committee as a parent donor member for a limited period, a role defined by transparency and rotation, not permanence. Dr. Harper's leadership was both tested and affirmed. She found herself explaining the covenant to skeptical parents, diffusing backlash, and championing the finer points of a reform process that demanded patience. The teachers appreciated that someone at the top had the courage to name the problem and the humility to ask for help. Daniel, the teacher who had acted as a whistleblower, was reassigned a role that carried less exposure and more support. The school took steps to ensure protection for staff who raised concerns. The school's culture changed in small but meaningful ways. Admissions officers adopted anonymized files when possible. Development and admissions met quarterly, not to influence decisions, but to create clearer boundaries and shared understanding. The board adopted an annual review that required public reporting on admissions metrics, aggregated and anonymized, so that trends could be monitored without violating privacy. To an outsider, it might have seemed incremental. To those inside the school, it felt like the difference between a rhetorical commitment to equity and a set of enforceable practices. The covenant had not eliminated the inequalities that exist in education, but it had established a standard. Money should not be the determinant of who learns in a classroom. Months after the covenant's adoption, Dr. Harper invited Marcus to a small ceremony in the library to recognize the scholarship program's inaugural recipients. The room smelled like fresh pages and coffee. Paper fans the students had made for an arts project hung from a string overhead. Marcus watched as 3 families received letters announcing funded aid. 2 of the recipients were first-generation students in new seats made possible by the scholarship fund. When it was his turn to speak, Marcus kept his words short. He told the children that their presence in the school was what mattered. The rest, his money, their background, was secondary to being known and taught well. He said without grandiosity that he had learned something very human and very difficult, that wealth without accountability can reproduce the very inequalities it claims to address. The room applauded, a soft, buoyant sound. Later, outside in the courtyard where the elm trees had grown greener with summer, Dr. Harper said something that took Marcus back to their first meeting. "You tested us," she said. "You could have shown up to make us look bad. Instead, you offered a partnership. That matters." Marcus thought of his earlier rehearsals, checks and curt nods behind mahogany desks, and of how naive they had been.
He thought of the sting of hearing a refusal and how that sting had become, in time, a steadying force. "You kept a boundary," he said. "That boundary made me do the work I should have done differently." Dr. Harper smiled without pride. "We're trying to be better," she said.
I'm trying to lead a school that can withstand scrutiny. The story did not end in triumph. A few parents left. Some donors pulled back entirely. A board member's resignation echoed for months. The school lost some money. It also gained a base of donors who preferred clarity to influence. The oversight committee's work continued, demanding vigilance and patience. For Marcus, the moral calculus had shifted. He still had the means to influence outcomes, but he had learned to regard influence as a stewardship that required structures. He had learned the difference between smoothing an outcome for his son and investing in systems that allowed many children to thrive. He watched Sam play basketball with boys from different backgrounds, and he noticed that his son's laughter had returned. That was the measure he wanted, small, ordinary signs of belonging. In private moments, Marcus acknowledged the complexity of what they had done. Institutional reform is often a tangle of thorny incentives, and the covenant was an imperfect instrument in a complicated ecosystem. Philanthropy still required careful strategy to avoid unintended consequences. Donors still had to be convinced that giving could be noble without seeking private returns. But the covenant had created a reference point, a standard that could be pointed to when the school's practices drifted. He thought too of the principal's words, the refusal that had shocked him into a different course. "We don't sell seats," she had said, with no heat and with steadiness. The phrase had been both a rebuke and an ethical pole star. It articulated a boundary that Marcus, at first startled, had come to respect. It had changed him from a parent tempted to buy peace into someone committed to the work of building fairer openings for children who were not yet visible in admission rolls. Months after the audit and after the covenant's adoption, Drayton convened a public town hall to present their progress. The meeting was streamed to parents and alumni. The presentation included anonymized metrics that showed an increase in students admitted from diverse socioeconomic backgrounds and an outline of the scholarship disbursement. The board posted the Oversight Committee's charter online and published a guide for ethical giving. These were not grand sweeping fixes. They were pragmatic steps intended to nudge institutional habit. One email reached Marcus afterward from a woman whose daughter had been admitted through the scholarship. She wrote simply, "My child used to hide in class. Now she raises her hand. Thank you." Marcus read the line twice and then again.
It was the simplest testimony he could imagine, one small child's confidence, and it stung in the way that real consequences often do. There were debates afterward about broader policy. Some parents pressed for donor names to be fully disclosed. Others argued for donor privacy. The tension between transparency and confidentiality did not vanish. But at Drayton, the terms of the debate had shifted. The default assumption was no longer that money should find its way toward influence. The default now was that influence must be earned by non-financial means. As the school year unfolded, small rituals revealed the slow work of cultural change. Admission panels began with anonymized files. Development met with the Oversight Committee to receive training on boundaries. Teachers felt more agency in curricular choices. The scholarship recipients, 3 the first year, then more, took on roles as student leaders, invited to share their experiences in classrooms and assemblies. The school's newsletters moved from touting names and donations to celebrating programs and student work. Marcus's life, in other ways, went on. His companies required attention. His foundation continued to fund programs across the city. But the way he thought about giving had been altered. He started conversations with other philanthropists about covenants and firewalls. Some balked, others listened. He realized that the act of giving responsibly required not merely generosity, but humility and an appetite for governance. On a late Sunday afternoon, months after the covenant and the committee, Marcus sat again in the library, this time not in a meeting, but alone with a book while Sam practiced scales in the next room. He listened to the ordinary rhythms of school life, the distant clap of a teacher returning a paper, the soft footfalls in the corridor, the low murmur of a child asking a question. Those sounds were not flashy. They were the small, necessary noises that mark a place where people learn and grow. He thought of the initial moment, the principal's refusal that had shocked him so deeply. He realized how easily that refusal could have hardened into resentment. Instead, it had opened a pathway. It had demanded that he think beyond buying a solution for his son and towards shaping a system that made such purchases unnecessary. Change, he had learned, required a combination of pressure and patience. It required documents and dialogues, audits and humility. It required a willingness to put resources behind structures rather than simply to purchase immediate outcomes. There would always be those who preferred the quick smoothing that money can provide. There would always be others who demanded radical distribution. Institutions would never be perfect, but they could be held to clearer standards. When Sam emerged from his piano practice, he found his father in the stack of library chairs, elbows on his knees. "How'd it go?" Marcus asked.
Sam shrugged, then offered a slow smile. Miss Carter said I did better on the scales. Calvin said my project idea is cool. He sounded small and content. That was enough. Marcus looked at the boy and thought of the covenant posted online, of the Oversight Committee's first yearly report, of the scholarship recipients walking into classrooms with new backpacks. He thought of the principal who had refused to sell a seat, and of the teacher who'd risked much to hand him an envelope. He thought of the board voting, the alumni resignations, the donors who had chosen new paths. He thought of the quiet, mutable thing that institutions are, aggregates of commitments that can, if pressed, be remade. He put a hand on Sam's shoulder and felt the ordinary warmth of parenthood, a warmth that no ledger could replace. If there was any single takeaway Marcus would have offered to himself in those months, it might have been this. Power without principle is a blunt instrument. Principle without power is impotent. Change is most durable when the two are paired with humility. There were still critics who said he had used his money to force a hand. Marcus could accept that judgment. He had, after all, used the leverage available to him. But he had done so with counsel, with constraints, and with a commitment to build something better, not to humiliate, but to hold accountable. The difference mattered. At the end of the school year, Dr. Harper sent Marcus a short note, unsigned and succinct. "Thank you for pushing us toward better." Marcus saved the note. He kept it in a drawer, not because he needed affirmation, but because it reminded him that sometimes a refusal, not a yes, is the clearest invitation to do things well. The reforms at Drayton did not erase inequality. They did, however, make one clear promise. If seats were to be earned, they would be earned because of merit, outreach, and robust support structures, not because of the loudness of a check. That promise was imperfect and required vigilance, but it had the shape of something lasting. Months later, Marcus received a short message from Nina. She had decided to produce a fuller piece about ethical philanthropy and institutional accountability, using Drayton as one example among many. Marcus agreed to be interviewed, but on condition that the piece not serve as a cudgel. He wanted the story told with care, to inspire other donors to consider how they could fund change without buying the outcomes they sought. On the day the feature ran, Marcus read it in a quiet corner of his office. Nina's piece balanced critique with hope. It quoted Dr. Harper's initial line, "We don't sell seats," but placed it within a larger narrative. A school that had chosen to confront its past, a parent who had swapped the impulse to buy for the burden of stewardship, and a community trying to align resources with mission. The article sparked conversations in other districts. Marcus received emails from heads of schools asking how they might adopt similar covenants. He received notes from philanthropists who confessed to being naive about how their gifts were sometimes construed. The conversation had widened. In the end, the most powerful change was not the covenant itself, but the precedent it set, that a principled refusal could be the catalyst for systemic repair. Marcus had gone into Drayton expecting the easy correction money often buys. Instead, he found a boundary, an invitation, and a responsibility he accepted. Years later, when Sam graduated from middle school at Drayton, Marcus watched from the back of the auditorium as children filed across the stage to collect certificates. Many faces were different from the ones that had filled the audience before. More socioeconomic diversity, more first-generation students, more children whose families had never imagined this school as a possibility. Marcus thought of the quiet work that had unfolded, a covenant, an audit, oversight, scholarships, conversations that could have been rancorous, but instead were stubbornly constructive. When the ceremony ended, Marcus stood in the courtyard where Dr. Harper had once refused his check. He looked at the building and, without ceremony, said to no one in particular, "We don't sell seats," echoing the phrase that had redirected him. But this time the words carried more than refusal. They carried the weight of what worth did in a community when it was protected by rules and by people who would hold one another to them. If you were in Marcus's place, how would you have acted? Would you have written the check and sat quietly, or pressed the institution to change? Tell us in the comments what you think. If this story moved you, share it with someone who cares about education fairness, and check the pinned comment for resources on how to support school equity in your own community.